All right. Welcome, everybody, to our live stream and discussion on the Restore trial. I was talking with our guests on the way into this live stream, and just kind of at awe with the probably massive undertaking that this trial was. We'll talk about that today, but wanted to thank you all for joining us. Would love to hear where you're all tuning in from, so if you can drop where you're at in the chat, we'd love to kind of hear where you're tuning in from. It is 7 p.m. here in Phoenix, Arizona. I know it's 10 a.m. over in Australia, so appreciate you all in the morning in Australia tuning in. For those of you in the U.S. tuning in the evening, good to have you here. But let's get into the discussion today. I wanted to welcome our two guests who are generously donating their time today. I'm going to have them both introduce themselves, but why don't we start with you? And it's a little difficult today because I have Peter and Peter, so we've decided PK, that's what Peter Kent goes by, and Pete as for Mr. O'Sullivan. So we're going to go by that today. PK, do you mind introducing yourself to the folks?
Sure. My name's Peter, or PK, and my clinical training is as a chiropractor and a physiotherapist. I practiced for about 20 years in musculoskeletal care, mostly in spinal pain, and then became an academic, and I've been an academic for the last 15 years.
Great. Well, appreciate you joining us today. Pete, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit to the audience?
Yeah, hi. So I'm originally came from New Zealand. I trained as a physiotherapist. I did my postgraduate manual therapy training in Australia, West Australia, Perth, and then kind of realised I had a bit of a crossroads where I then did a PhD, and pretty much since that time, it was in the 90s. I've worked both as a clinician and as a researcher. So I kind of got these. I run these two roads, both clinical research and practice, which is a beautiful interplay between working with patients in pain, testing hypotheses, essentially.
Yeah, it is unique. You have your own laboratory to kind of work with patients, which is awesome. I wanted to get a little bit into just the history kind of CFT. I've been fortunate enough to take a course with you at the San Diego Pain Summit, Pete, and really have enjoyed the approach, and it's definitely sings to our biases here as far as person-centered care and the things that we talk about on the podcast. But I'd love to hear, and maybe PK, if you can lead us off as far as kind of your kind of history with the approach, what brought you to the approach with CFT.
That's a great question, Mark. So I worked in a variety of settings in hospitals and rehab centres and in primary care, and I realised that I felt like I was missing something. In particular, I was missing something in terms of the biopsychosocial side. I was really into manual therapy, and I'd done a postgraduate course in physio manual therapy as well as chiropractic, but I felt like there was something that I couldn't quite get my finger on, and it was really around dealing with people's distress and the relationship between that and pain. And that led me into thinking about subgrouping, and I did a PhD in subgrouping methodology, and I went from Australia after that to Denmark and worked for 7 years on large clinical registries looking at subgrouping. And that wasn't all that revealing, and my sense was that maybe subgrouping was useful for identifying clinical pathways, but probably not so much about making decisions, clinical decisions about individual patients. And it was in Denmark that I got exposed to cognitive functional therapy, and I was attracted to it because it seemed a way of actually actualizing or doing in the clinic the biopsychosocial model, but it also did it within this structured clinical reasoning model that allowed you to make decisions about individual patients. So not long after that, I got invited by Pete's group to come back to Australia and go to Perth and work with them on that approach. And the Restore trial is one of the things that came out of that collaboration.
Awesome. Pete, I know you've had a big hand in this as well, but I'd love to hear kind of your background and kind of history leading up into it.
Yeah, so look, I suppose my background, as I said, I trained as a manual therapist, and I remember my first year after training as a manual therapist, I came out with all these tools like handling skills, and I had two jobs. One was in a pain clinic with people who were profoundly disabled, people who were on morphine, who are, you know, in wheelchairs, couldn't function, who were so sensitized I couldn't do anything with. And I realized my skill set was just completely inadequate to deal with that group of patients. I was also worked in a private practice setting where people would come in with aches and pains and a bit of stiffness, and I could crack and push them and make them feel better for a short time. Sometimes they'd come back. And I realized at that point as well, there was very little evidence that we could really, that physiotherapists had anything to offer for these people who are profoundly disabled. And it really led me down this path of going, we need to understand what's going on better, and we need better tools to direct care towards these people. And so that's really been my career of, you know, being part of a journey which has also incorporated a lot of development of understanding pain, but also seeing through the patient's lens. And I think so often we've come to treatment through our lens and not the patient's lens, is saying, actually, what's the lived experience of people in pain? What are the beliefs that these people have? Where do they get them from? What are the things that we're doing with them? Why is it back pain is the leading cause of disability with people who are profoundly distressed? What have we done in our system to create that? And then what can we do to help people in a journey out of it? And that's sort of been our, you know, such a privileged journey of learning from people with lived experience, of being able to go back to the clinic and take the time and learn from people and learn about, you know, what this has kind of evolved from that clinical space, but also to road test it in terms of testing hypotheses. And pretty much, you know, my career has been unraveling all my own clinical beliefs, and then luckily replacing it with stuff that actually seems to make sense and work. So the Restore trial is really a really important trial for our team, because it was the biggest trial that could systematically, number one, train a bunch of physiotherapists to competency, which is part of that. It's kind of like a double trial. One was, can we train people to deliver this, who have relatively, you know, mixed bag of people from different walks of life across two cities? And then if we do train them, does it make a difference for a really tough group of patients who are pretty much at the end of the line around back pain?
Sure. Yeah, I had some questions just kind of on the training too. It was quite extensive in the study. I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of like 80 hours or somewhere in that ballpark.
Yeah.
I'm curious, a couple of things, and we'll bring up the kind of graphic on CFT for those of you who are watching. The training, I'd love to hear how that went, and kind of maybe go into you know, the structure of all that, and then also like maybe as you've kind of were training, I'd be curious. Just my own curiosity is like, did you have any more difficulties with the older clinicians, or other difficulties experienced? I just know for me personally, and I think you mentioned it, like all this unraveling that needs to take place. There's less to unravel when you're a little earlier in the profession. So I'm just wondering what your experience was there.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there are lots of questions in that question, actually. So we were lucky to include people from 2 years post-graduation to people with 35 years post-graduation. And you know, with experience, we, you know, that can be hugely advantageous around understanding and seeing a lot of different people with different perspectives. But it can also mean that we have our own clinical behaviors that are really ingrained that we can't even see anymore. So I think, you know, a lack of experience, you don't have the kilometers on the miles on the clock, but you do come with a freshness, I suppose, and probably a more you know, your training hopefully would be more up to date in terms of understanding pain, etc. So that was a mixture of pros and cons, and I think, you know, what we saw is that we could train both groups basically towards developing competency. The thing that really, you know, we often hear about this, oh my God, it's 80 hours. 80 hours is nothing when you look at how much money is spent on this problem. You know, what does it take to train a surgeon to fuse a back, which costs 50 grand, and it delivers the same outcomes with significant risks of, you know, non-surgical care? like, we have to stop apologizing for upskilling our profession. And if you look at where physios have come from, or PTs have come from, we come from a very structural biomechanical understanding of pain. And then we know the guidelines are saying we need to address the physical and psychosocial barriers to recovery, right? What skills and training have we had on that? And we see in the qualitative syntheses that are out there that physios are saying we don't have confidence to explore these things. We don't have the skills to do that. And so the training was, number one, upskilling knowledge, and then creating skills. And then the really key part of this training was direct mentoring while they work with people with disabling pain. And a lot of the physios in the training have said, we haven't even seen these people before. We haven't seen people who've had a panic attack during a consult. We haven't seen people who are this disabled, who are this distressed. We don't know how to manage it. And so part of the training was really giving them tools and confidence to help these people understand what was going on, to give them confidence in their body, to get back to stuff in life that they valued. Because a lot of us are fearful about pain. We're often fearful as clinicians of hurting our patients. We don't feel comfort with dealing with their distress. And so that's actually not a huge dose of training for the mountain to climb, in my mind.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious too. Like when you look at the infographic here, how deep are you getting into like the sciences and stuff, or is this more just like conceptual? This is getting like more experiential learning for the physios. And I know there's a lot of mentored practice, and you guys utilize social media kind of with Facebook groups and things like that. I'm curious if you can speak to the like kind of the mode of learning that these folks, because I think it's one thing to kind of learn it in a 2-day course, but when you're having mentor practice with skilled clinicians to help you deliver, I think it's a different animal.
Yeah, totally. And look, the knowledge part for us is about, we have to understand the science of pain. We have to understand the facts of it. We have to understand it's multifactorial. We have to understand the factors are different for every single person. We have to explore them, identify them, but we have to be patient-centered. We have to understand their goals. We have to understand their motivations, their fears. That's a whole jigsaw puzzle to unravel. And then to take that back to the person who's been told they're damaged, and that pain is a sign of damage, and they have to protect their body. And there are all these rules around posture and bracing their core and all the stuff we tell people. And to validate the person and invalidate their beliefs is a really tricky dance. And that's the really critical part of, like, I think it's relatively easy to identify the factors. It's a way harder job to take someone on a journey to really do a U-turn on their belief systems and their behaviors, and to do it in a sensitive way where they feel validated and supported, and guide them away from looking for effects to actually realizing that they can be in charge of their own healthcare. That's a massive U-turn. So that's kind of like the journey that we see CFT going on, and that was a journey that we coached the clinicians to go on. And so, to be clear on how it looked, we had a group of, say, 9 physio PTs in a room across 2 days. Every one of them would see a patient with disabling back pain. We would, as a trainer, would sit with them and coach them through it around the interview, the examination, of framing the understanding of pain, which we don't call pain science. We kind of call it making sense. It's around identifying the factors that are relevant for that person and helping them make sense of it through their own experience and their own, their own lived experience, essentially. And so there was a learning from everyone watching the physios do it. And we saw about 80 people across that time. Would be 40 in each of the groups. There's a group trained in Sydney, a group. So there was this kind of database of 40 people they've been exposed to, of listening to their stories and seeing their individual behaviors, their goals, their obstacles, their roadblocks, looking at how we could negotiate them, and kind of workshopping that through as a group, which was a really rewarding experience. And, we saw physios who were so unconfident, or, really felt distressed at someone else's distress, towards actually feeling, us sitting back watching them competently, explore what was happening in someone's life, explore their distress, being comfortable with their, their emotions, of helping them make sense of it, and then building a pathway for them. That was such a rewarding experience for us to see that kind of shift over a period of 5 months.
Yeah, I
And
can.
maybe, Mark,
Yeah.
just to add a couple of things, what Pete didn't mention was that there was a competency checklist, which all of the consultations were marked against. So the physios went away with what they had done well and what they needed to work on. And also those videos were in a private video channel that the clinicians could look at subsequently. So they could look at their own, or they could go back to something that occurred in someone else's where they really were interested in what did happen there and what can I learn more about that.
Yeah, I think that's really important, PK. And just on that, we sort of see the checklist not as you got to follow a set structure. It's like this is the field you play in. We just didn't want people doing crazy stuff or saying crazy stuff, but we wanted them to really follow the structure of what we thought were the key elements of the intervention. And the checklist was a really helpful guide for us as trainers, but also for the clinicians to self-reflect. Which kind of allow them to go, these are kind of the things that I need to work on each month as I go away and work with patients. So, yeah.
And sorry, Mark, just another element was there was an ebook which the clinicians could also refer to, which was quite thorough. So they could go away from a consultation like that and then go back into the ebook and go, what is it that's there that can help me better understand how I might do this better, or guide me to different options, etc.
Great. I will say I'm jealous of these clinicians because it's an approach. Just having a little taste of it for 2 days in San Diego it just again tickles the biases of things, and just speaking to both of you of that transition from the find it fix it mentality of the manual therapy world, and again for acute maybe tissue specific type things. Of course there might be some place for it, but it's a hard transition, and then being able to have that mentored with some folks overseeing that transition and helping you gain some stability in that destabilizing dance that happens when you're questioning some of those approaches, I'm sure was nice for those folks.
Yeah, I suppose the nice thing is, from my own perspective, that's been my journey. Like I've done that. Like I've been in that situation. So it's not like we're sitting there in judgment. We're sitting there going, "Yep, that's tough. I know that feeling."
Some serious empathy for sure.
Yeah. And there's also another element in that the way in which these clinicians were trained is the product of a long period of experimentation, if you like, and how to train people. Pete, maybe you'd like to talk to the Finnish experience.
Yeah, we'd had copped quite a lot of criticism around the hours of training, so we thought we'd do a short training program to see whether it was enough. And this was carried out in Finland, where there were two workshops essentially, with a gap in between and some support via a Facebook page. And well, it's interesting. The physiotherapist said it wasn't enough. So they're like, we still don't feel skilled. We need mentoring. We need basic skills. We need feedback. It's not enough to go to a workshop. And, I think it kind of reflects on what's out there in our PT landscape. We have so many workshops, and it's like we have a smorgasbord of knowledge and a few technical skills, but how do you actually package that together to take a highly distressed person on a journey that makes sense for them, teaches them self-management to get their life back? That's a whole different story that you can't do at a workshop. And that's what we found in the Finnish study, essentially, was it wasn't enough to give knowledge, not enough to go to a workshop. What we often hear is people go, yeah, I do that. Yeah, I've done that workshop, I do that. And the thing is, we have blind spots, and there was a recent study, lovely study, that looked at this, what people think they do and what they actually do. And you take a film and watch what we do. We all have blind spots. We don't even know half the time what we say, the body language, the kind of non-verbal cues that we give when we shut people down and we ignore their cues. We don't pick up on the cues. We might shut down their emotions, etc. We don't know it until you see it and you get the feedback. You go back and go, shit. And I've had that experience myself, of going back and watching the video myself with a patient and going, oh, that was awful. Like I didn't know I'd said that. And it's kind of, it elicits these implicit responses that kind of tap into our deep often discomfort around dealing with emotional factors ourselves, or dealing with people's distress, and it kind of taps into our, and that's what the physios told us, is that was a behavior change intervention for them.
Yeah, yeah, no, I can imagine. And I would agree. I mean, I didn't do it obviously in this context, but having yourself videoed in a examination is a very humbling experience, because again, it does definitely, bring to light some of the implicit behaviors that, when you start reflecting upon them, may not be the most ideal when you're trying to validate somebody's experience and move them in a positive direction. I'm wondering, PK, if you don't mind kind of discussing a little bit of, I brought the infographic for those of you watching on YouTube, and those you can watch the recording, of course. If you can kind of go over the kind of summary of the trial. You don't have to go into every nuts and bolts, but just the summary of how the trial kind of was laid out and some of the results.
Sure, happy to. So we've been talking about the training of 18 physios, and perhaps what's worth adding is that they all had little exposure to CFT before they came into the trial. So we recruited 496 people who had chronic low back pain. On average, they had pain for 4 years. That wasn't an inclusion criteria, it was just 3 months or more, but that gives you a sense of the population that we had. On average, they had 13.5 points on a RMDQ, or Roland Morris Disability scale, and that's quite a lot. That's more than most large low back pain trials. Typically, they're around 9.5, 9.6. And in our population, they also had an average pain intensity of 6 out of 10. So considerable pain and considerable disability. We were also more inclusive of people who had physical comorbidities and mental health challenges and older age, compared with traditional large low back pain trials. So when we were looking at clinical effectiveness, the primary outcome was the Roland Morris Disability Questionnaire, or pain-related activity limitation, and the primary economic outcome was quality adjusted life years. So what did we find? Sorry, I should say that the follow-up period was 12 months, and we were sampling every 3 months and a little bit more frequently during the treatment period, which was 3 months. So what did we find? Well, on that primary outcome measure of disability, we found large and clinically important effects for the two groups. That's the top or larger diagram you can see at the moment. And we saw those effects at the end of the treatment period, but we also saw them continue through to 12 months, which is unusual, not unprecedented, but unusual at that size. So the interesting thing was, when you look at the rest of that diagram, you can see there's 6 other outcomes there, which are secondary clinical outcomes. Basically, we see the same thing occurred on every outcome that we measured, and there were some dichotomous outcomes, and we saw the same for those as well. Now, that is also unusual in low back pain. Often it's a bit patchy. So when we see this consistent change of large clinically important effects that persist at 12 months, it gives us more confidence that something really did happen, and whatever changed, that change endured. So the sort of things that were the secondary outcomes were pain intensity, anxiety, depression, pain self-efficacy, treatment satisfaction. In terms of the economic outcomes, what we also saw, the same as with the clinical outcomes, was that both the CFT groups were more cost effective than usual care. So at a societal level, what that means is that there were cost savings of more than 5,000 Australian dollars per patient over that year. So just to put that in context, that's $500,000 for 100 patients. So that's a considerable saving to society, and most of those economic gains were through increased participation in paid and unpaid work, and that's usually where the money is in terms of treating chronic low back pain. Yes, there are direct costs, but the real cost is this participation component. Now, I've been talking about 2 CFT groups, but I haven't yet told you what was the difference between the 2 groups. So one group was CFT only, The other group was CFT plus wearable sensor biofeedback. So these were wireless sensors that we put on people. They were on both the CFT groups. We put them on people, and the difference between the third group, the sensor biofeedback group, was the information that those sensors measured was visible to the patient and the clinician in the consultation, but also it had a capacity for individualized biofeedback to be programmed so that when the patient went home or back to work, then there were reminders in real time based on the movements that were important for that person to either facilitate movement or encourage them to not do something. What we found was the addition of that sensor biofeedback did not improve either the clinical outcomes or the economic outcomes in the context of cognitive functional therapy. The last thing that we found was that CFT was safe. So there was no difference across the three groups in the rate of adverse events or serious adverse events.
And just to pick up on that point, I think one of the things that we get criticized for is we explicitly try and break these rules that we tell people with back pain. You got to sit up straight, you got to lift with the straight back, you got to brace your core when you move. We're like, nah, no evidence for that. and people go, that's dangerous. You can't say that to people, they're going to rupture discs. We didn't see that. So I think that's actually really important that often we don't look at those things, but because we get that feedback all the time. It's like, oh God, you guys are so irresponsible saying this stuff, but actually that's not the lived experience that we saw with people going through this program. That actually, we explicitly train people not to protect their back, to re-engage with movement in normal ways, and not not be hyper vigilant around the body and posture to get their life back. And it reduced pain, it reduced disability, and it was safe, and it made them more confident, and they were less fearful, and they were thinking less catastrophic thoughts about their back. It all kind of lines up.
You speak to that, and I still remember at the course I went to with CFT when you were having some people doing some exposure with control. There was a sports physio. I won't name names, but very highly followed on the social media scene, and was just, I remember reading his social media feed, oh, this person's going to be destroyed tomorrow, and all these things. It is just like this implicit beliefs that we operate so rigidly under that we have a hard time just stepping above and just looking down and saying, gosh, are these founded in truth, or is this what it's just a hard challenge. And I still see it, and I agree. I'm watching some of the social media reactions just to this trial has been interesting to see where people are at with it. But,
so true.
Yeah. I'm curious, with this trial, and there's been some trials in the low back, chronic low back literature. I'm just curious, and maybe PK, you can start as far as why you think this trial is kind of unique, and what kind of unique things it adds to the literature as far as, there's some treatment effect things and some long-term things I know you spoke to, but I'm just curious, what makes this trial unique and maybe a significant value add to what we have in the chronic low back pain literature.
Sure, Mark. So there were sort of three largest or medium-sized trials before this. They were a bit disparate. They had different, or two had the same comparison group, one had a different comparison group. But there were differences about the design, there were differences about the training, and so there were also differences about the outcome. So there was a need for a large trial. There had been no trial in Australia. There had been nothing that compared with the most pragmatic comparison group, which is usual care. And it's interesting that, as a field, we know very little about usual care. And yet that's, in fact, the comparator that patients are interested in. It's the comparator that funders are interested if they're paying for usual care. We took the trouble to try and understand a bit about what usual care is, and that's also unusual in a clinical trial. There had been no clinical trials of CFT looking at the economic outcomes, and we were really interested in that because, yes, there's some training involved, but it also takes longer consultation times. And so we were interested to get a sense of, does an incremental cost of a treatment save money downstream? So that's why we did the economic investigation. Of course, there the wearable sensor thing was a new element to it. So all of those things, I think, to some extent or rather, are not only hallmarks of the trial or differences, but they're also things that I think we have some sense of an answer to now.
Yeah, and kind of as you speak to the biofeedback device, I'm curious what spurred that to be added to the study. I know you mentioned a little bit of in some of the, and then maybe if you have, I know it's anecdotal, but I mean maybe there was something you both saw clinically that said, hey, maybe there's something to this. I'm just curious where the biofeedback device. It makes sense to me from some of the movement challenges that our folks with chronic low back pain have. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. Look, it's a great question. So, as PTs, we spend a lot of time thinking about movement. And we, as manual-therapists, we spend an extraordinary amount of time trying to influence movement in some time and trying to think biomechanically. What we were thoughtful about is what is the relationship between change in movement and change in other outcomes, like change in pain, change in disability? What is that relationship? And we know very little about that. So we wanted to collect sensor data both to see did the biofeedback work, but we also had a kind of sleeper in there in that we had these sensors recording the data, sending it to the cloud without the clinician needing to see it, which would allow us to try and do some mechanistic work of unteasing, if you like, some of the causal mechanisms of what's going on, which is to say, so when someone does change their movement in a clinically relevant movement, what's the relationship of that? Particularly, what's the temporal relationship? Does that shift occur before change in pain and change in activity limitation, or is it the reverse? So there was a mechanistic element to that. But there was also that I'd been involved in a clinical trial which used sensors in an individualized intervention and had quite large clinical effects, but we didn't know whether it was the sensors or whether it was the individualized approach. So that was a sort of design or architectural element of the design where it was constructed to say, so is it the individualized bit or is it the addition of the sensor feedback bit?
So I'm wondering, should we expect some further kind of perusing of this data? It sounds like with the mechanistic stuff. No, I'll be interested to see. It sure makes sense, and I'll be anxious to see when that kind of comes down the pipeline. I know you all have a pretty big research agenda going, so I'll anxiously.
And there's another element. There's a delicious element in this, and that is, we could look at this from a purely research, purely mechanistic, and say which is the driver on the causal pathway, if that was our model. But one possibility is they all change together. There is no temporal separation. They're all part of the dance that's going on in the clinical encounter. And then it raises the question of, so is working with the movement important or not? And that's such a deep question for us as clinicians, because it's one of the things that separates us from clinical psychologists, for example. And, from a holistic perspective, I was recently watching a video of an Aboriginal man talking about his experience with CFT, and he was talking about, he's a psychologist, and he was talking about this key moment in the therapy where he realized that there was a lot kind of buried in the body that he had to acknowledge and work with before his mind shifted. And it struck me, this is holistic care. We have to work with both these things. And it's not that the movement is just a whipping boy, it's just a convenient way of placing our clinical attention. It's a way in, it's the sleeper when we're really doing other things. I think it's more nuanced than that. My view is it's holistic. There's a dance going on between the body and the person and their mind and their experience. And that's a great place for PTs to be because we're good at that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that sometimes you hear the criticisms and like we're the lines are blurring too much. We're stepping way into the psychologist role. Yet, I'm guessing it's the same over in Australia, where it's like, you know, pain psychologists is like finding a unicorn. Over here in the U.S., it just they're far and few between, and I know they're begging for more assistance to help kind of the mental health challenges that. I'm just curious where you're at with some of those discussions of like crossing those lines. I mean, to me, it's like our patients sure need it. They sure you know, are benefiting from it, and you know, you can do it in a skilled fashion. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a real, like, we think deeply in this space, and we've been very lucky to work with some amazing pain psychologists as well. And the psychologists that I work with tell us, like, and the patients tell us, the patients sort of sitting in the middle, and often the PT's here and the psychologist is here, we haven't met in the middle. You know, we have to move. For us to adequately and effectively treat people with pain, we have to understand that there is deeply, it's an emotional, cognitive, and social element to pain. Like, you should be working with people with pain if you don't acknowledge that, in my view. And we haven't been adequately skilled or trained to work with that. Now, from a clinician perspective, that may be unraveling a history of early life trauma that we can then refer that patient on to a clinical psychologist. But we may be the first person to be told that in that person's experience. So that's on us, in my mind. If we don't ask, we will never find out. And I know in my history, you know, I've seen traumatized people who I never would have asked that question of. You need a trusting relationship to do that with. And so we have to move as a profession, in my view. We have to move to be with the patient, because the other thing is responding to what the patients are asking for. They are asking for us to consider their, you know, what's happening in their world and to incorporate that into our care, and we're not doing it. And there's this whole embodiment piece, which I think is, you know, where a lot of my understanding has grown as a clinician and as a researcher. That is a really pivotal piece of this work, which the clinical psychologists are telling us they don't do. It's different. It's not what they do, or the people I've talked to. And so we have this beautiful opportunity, in my mind, and obviously completely biased, to shift physiotherapy practice to be biopsychosocial, but to have boundaries where we're not, you know, I am not skilled to deal with people with, you know, early life trauma, but I will support them as they work in co-care with a psychologist to walk that path and to kind of, you know, move beyond trauma to getting their life back. But yeah, we see a clear line around scope of practice, but we need to move further towards the center of being person-centered, in my mind.
Yeah, I would agree. I think so. You know, these lines of professional boundaries were drawn with knowledge bases around pain that were very old school,
Exactly.
you know, to where we're not, you know, our knowledge bases long exceeded these professional lines for especially around pain. So we're doing patients a disservice if we continue to ascribe to this very rigid, narrow space of the musculoskeletal only versus the psychological. I would agree wholeheartedly.
And look, CFT is not there to replace clinical psychology. We work with clinical psychologists. We have really, really tough, you know, people with really tough life circumstances, with comorbid mental health challenges, who we need additional support. So it's not like we don't go, oh, this is the panacea for everybody. Like, this has made an impact on people, which is, we think, looks like it's important. That's not, it didn't help everyone. And we need to get better at understanding what we need to do to help those people as well. And we see co-care, integrated co-care, as a next opportunity beyond this trial.
You know, I'd love to hear a little bit about the criticisms. You know, PK, I'm not sure how active you are on social media. I haven't seen you on social media as much, which I
feed him.
Yeah. So Pete distills the message that he's hearing from Twitter, because I know Pete's primary mode of interaction is Twitter. I'm just curious.
I share the pain with them.
You know, and I applaud you both, and I applaud anybody for putting it out there. You know, they're putting your work out there for a free critique. And maybe we'll talk about some of the PR components behind this, because I think you've really done a great job with the website and all these different things. But I'm wondering if you can discuss a little bit about the critiques you've received. I mean, you don't have to get into some of the ridiculous ones. Some of them probably don't even warrant discussion. But any of the critiques you've found and heard so far that you would want to respond to or maybe discuss?
Where do we start?
PK, why don't you start? It's been distilled to you. Pete's passed along some of the words, so if you don't mind chatting a little bit about what the criticisms have been and maybe what your response would be.
Sure. Well, I think one of the criticisms that I've heard is around the usual care, that this wasn't enough care. It's an interesting position to take, because we didn't set out to control for the type of treatment or the number of consultations. We just set out to take people from their usual care experience and expose them to something else, and we didn't restrict them from their usual care. So this was what would happen if someone came off the street looking for a new approach and had this. And so when we look at the cohort, around half, 56%, were taking pain medication at baseline, and about 30% were taking analgesics, about 30% were taking anti-inflammatories, and about 20% were taking opioids. Now, there's a piece that we're going to do that we haven't started yet, which is to look at, did that medication use change, and did it change differentially over the treatment period? But we don't know the answer to that. But they were taking medication. In the usual care and in the CFT groups, people sought care during the treatment session and after the treatment session. So around 1 in 3 people was seeking care, and on average they saw, or rather more precisely, the median was 3 visits during the consultation period, and that continued, that pattern, through 12 months. So they saw around 12 consultations in the year. And the sort of people that they saw, 75% of them were seeing medical doctors, mostly their GPs, and the next most common was physiotherapy. Now, that's all patient self-report. We don't have that in a clinical registry. It's not Europe. It's just people out doing their thing in the Australian health landscape. But there's an idea that somehow that isn't enough care. And so that really makes me think about, so what do we know about usual care? And what do we know about people who have persistent musculoskeletal pain? And the answer is we know very little. But I was involved in a Danish PhD where Søren Moser, a Danish physiotherapist, looked at 3,000 people, and he looked at data for 10 years. So these are 3,000 people with chronic musculoskeletal pain, most of it's back pain. The Danish system is that almost every healthcare consultation has a government payment in it. So therefore the data is really high quality. You really get a sense of what's going on. And so what he did was look at trajectories of care seeking. So there was a high care seeking group that was about 10%. They saw about 22 consultations in a year. At the other end of the spectrum was the biggest component. That's 40% of the cohort either saw no one or saw very few. So the median was 0, but it could have been the interquartile was up to 3. And then in between you see a medium group, which is about 12 consultations, the same as in the Restore trial. And you see some people start low and building up over 10 years, some people start in the middle and then it tapers off. So he then interviewed people. And he interviewed people primarily from the people that were seeing lots, 22 consultations a year, and the people that were seeing almost none or none. He also interviewed a few people who were in the median group. And the overwhelming thing that they all said was, it's not working for us. The system is failing us in the sense we're not getting the care like we feel we need. And people responded to that in different ways. The people in the high care group just kept shopping. They just went for it to see could they find someone who eventually would kind of answer their questions and give them the care that would make them satisfied. And the people at the other end, the 40%, most people, the biggest group, simply decided it wasn't worth it anymore. Pain was part of their life and they'd just get on with it. And so our group, on average was 12. That looks like this chronic back pain population. On average, people saw 12 consultations a year. That's what our population was like. So I don't think the sample that we had was any different from Soren Moses' study of 3,000 people. I think we just tapped into that population.
And just on that too, we've got qualitative studies embedded in this trial. And the story we're hearing is very much like that. We've heard stories of people who've just had so much care and just given up. They're just going, this is my life. I'm just exhausted. I don't trust healthcare practitioners. I'm done. I've had it. I've been to physios, chiros, had injections. I might have had spinal surgery. I've taken the drugs, and I'm just exhausted and fatigued by this. And so it's very tempting to go, that trial's got exaggerated effects because these people, if we compared it to good manual therapy, they would have done really well. It's kind of interesting to consider if you've had it to give it more, and look, that's the nature of this trial. It's what we set out to do, is to go, okay, let's, we've been criticized, it's the irony, been criticized in the past to go, well, you compared it to this physio intervention to that one. What about usual care? Because what's the natural course of these people? And interestingly, they did get a bit better, but not a huge amount better, which is also what we know a bit about that group of people who are really in trouble, is they don't get off that trajectory very easily. It's hard to shift that, particularly in the long term. You can make a dent in it, but they often go back to their old trajectory again. We didn't see that in this trial. And we're doing a 3-year follow-up of this group as well, because we're really interested in how enduring these effects are, because we actually saw a trend towards the effects getting bigger, not less, at 12 months, which is different to the 2 previous trials that we'd been involved in with really tough people, which is why we put the booster in there at 6 months.
Yeah, and I thought that was interesting, and I know it reflects some of what you found in earlier studies where that booster session, some of the effects were trailing off. And is that something you see as something that's a necessary kind of?
I do. Yeah. And I don't know, we don't quite know exactly what it does, but I think what it tells, it's a signal to people, you're not done with us. We've got your back. This is a tough journey. You will have roadblocks. You will have flare-ups. We want you to help you and support you with that journey. It's a chronic health problem. It's not like you go to the doctor with diabetes and go, yeah, we're done with your treatment. See you later. Never see you again. I think we have to change how we think about managing chronic pain, to say, this is a journey. We want to help you build tools to self-care, but there will be times in your life where you have a flare-up or a step back and you might freak out and you're not in control. We want you to come back to us. We want to support you on that journey to help you navigate that. And I think that's what the 6-month booster signaled. That's my belief. Again, the quality data will tell us more about this down the track. But I think it sends a signal that, we're there to support you on the long haul.
Yeah, no, I think, and they also have to venture out into a society after your study that is full of all sorts of lovely messages and easily. I just see this with patients, and I'm probably a lot of the clinicians who are working with a lot of persistent pain where you have somebody on a really good path and then they encounter, whether it be a healthcare practitioner who's operating under some dated beliefs, or the latest infomercial hits the airwaves that gets them believing that they're damaged goods. So it makes sense to keep them kind of connected and tethered to us to make sure we have that kind of lifeline if they do start slipping back into bad behaviors.
And we don't always get it. Look, I had a patient yesterday who came in and she goes, I'm so upset. I ended up getting my back fused. And I'm in so much worse. And I just so regret going down this path. And I should have come back. And, she'd had a massive pain flare. Lots of stuff was happening in this person's life. She'd been sold this promise is going to fix her. And actually, she's in so much worse place now. And you can't unturn that. And it's like, you know, and I'm like, oh, I just wish she'd got back to me. You know, I was traveling, she'd tried, I was out of the country, and she didn't, you know, it just, and it just highlighted to me that we have to, you know, that relationship of being the person they call and contact, and you know, when they're having a tough time, they will reach someone, and it could be they go to emergency, or they go and see the back to GP. GP, you know, look, you've tried this and you're going well, but actually, let's get that rotten disc fused. And it's so tantalizing when someone's in a really tough place in their life. They just want someone to chop their pain out.
Yeah.
And sadly, it just doesn't work that way a lot of the time.
Yeah, no, I can relate to that. Those type of stories. It's tough to hear. With you talking about, you know, the and we just spoke to a little bit about some of the societal messages and things like that. You've made a pretty conscious effort, and you've done it in the past with your work. I know there was the pain -ed site, and now the Restore Trial has its own website with, you know, a lot of kind of multimedia things. I'm just curious if either you, PK, or Pete, could speak to a little bit of the digital strategy behind it, as far as to support what was kind of the thought process behind that. Maybe was it just, you know, strictly let's spread the message and have some ability to the press and the public to get their eyes on it, or what was your purpose behind it?
Yeah. I'm happy to speak to that first. I mean, we spend so much of our time around, well, two things. PK and I, before the trial came out, got a bunch of consumers together who've been through the intervention and said, can you just tell us about how you think this is going to land, this paper will land? And it was amazing, wasn't it, Peter? We had this whole outpouring of the frustration, the lack of trust in healthcare, this failed treatments, and this, you know, just this exhaustion of giving up around care, and how tough it was to build trust again, that actually there might be hope. So that we heard that. And then what that journey looked like, that it was so tough for some people. It was like they had all these hurdles and roadblocks and flare-ups, and that partnership was so important. And so that led that co-design around the infographic, which is on the website. So I love it because it's their words. We've just packaged together. We got you know, Emma was the designer of that, who kind of told the story of that. The tree that was kind of dead, and this kind of bringing back to the life of the garden, and that kind of enriching of their lives in so many other ways. So we kind of wanted to share that message, but we also know that a lot of people find scientific literature really hard to digest. So we wanted to tell the story of the clinician journey, and we wanted to tell the story of the trial and how we got to it and what it meant, and kind of more in a more accessible way. And we also wanted to share stories of patients who've gone through the journey, and they'll be coming up on the website soon. They're amazing stories. They're heart-wrenching. They'll bring you to tears, of real stories of people who just got to the end of the line and thought it was all over. We think that's so important because there is a fundamental lack of hope in my mind around healthcare. When you've done it all and you're just going, that's my lot. And I think there's a lack of hope amongst clinicians. When they hear those stories, they lose hope. So for us, the translational space is so important. And, you know, we're grateful that people are giving us good feedback on that, because that's our main agenda, actually. That's why we do what we do. We don't bust their asses working evenings and nights to just get a Lancet paper. It's about, can we make a difference for people? Can we support clinicians on that journey? If we can do a little bit in that space, then it was worth it.
Yeah, no, I think I've really enjoyed just the approach with that, and I think we'll talk a little bit about some of the future publication. I know you have some things in the pipeline with this data set, it sounds like, but you know, the patient stories, like, are you doing anything more? I know you're putting those up, it sounds like, to where, 'cause I think that's so powerful, because it's when it's coming from a clinician's voice. I mean, they've already been talked to by clinicians and promised a bag of goods, and have it continuously not deliver the things. Where are you using those patient stories, and do you see, I mean, you've done a lot of great qualitative, I know you've done some mixed methods, there's qualitative within this trial I know you mentioned. I'm just curious where you find those patient stories and the value that they bring to just the whole change that you're looking to engender.
I think they're central to CFT. It's the patient. It's all about the patient's story and their agenda and their dance and their journey. And we want this to be about the patient. So it's so important, and the qualitative work will capture that as well. Where we've not met people's, where we're not helped them as well. It's also really important for us to learn about how we can negotiate and support people, because we don't. It's not a panacea. It's tough.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And we had a question of any plans to release any qualitative research around this.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds
there
like
are two qualitative studies that will come out of this.
You may or may not be able to answer this, because you maybe the conclusion needs to wait till the paper comes out. But was there encouraging mechanistic results that you with the movement, the biofeedback that you think will be helpful to guide maybe some decision making, some treatments in the future?
Yeah, look, honestly, we have no results yet. We both got a text yesterday from a PhD student who's deep in this analysis, but we have no results yet. As you can imagine, it's an enormous amount of data, and it takes an enormous amount of time to clean and analyze, but we're getting close. Just going back, a little more about the sort of mechanistic approach. We're looking at the relationship between movement and the outcomes that I mentioned. But we're also looking at change in distress, so change in anxiety and depression and pain self-efficacy, and saying, what's the relationship between those things? Are they mediators of the outcome? But we're also going to look at them together to see if we can better understand, the whole system, because of course it's all going on at once. And just going back to Pete's point about qualitative, and Pete said too, we have two papers coming out from qualitative papers from clinicians about the clinician journey, but we also have qualitative papers from the patient perspective.
Yeah.
No, that's great. I think that's a unique perspective. I mean, we do have some qualitative work in the clinician space, but it's not. I'll be definitely interested to hear their perspectives and their journeys, because I think sometimes that transition. I mean, we talk about it in the struggles and the crossing the chasm and different things that we have to make when we're switching kind of our mode of operation. But I look forward to that paper for sure. Any other things that you feel like maybe are coming out of that data set that are going to offer some value, or things that you think have really pushed into more questions? Obviously, research only generates more questions and more things we want to ask. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on this. And we have a few other questions coming in, so I'll start posing those once you guys chat about that.
Sure. We are very interested in implementation and have a number of implementation studies either underway or about to start, and more kind of stacked up. The conversation with clinicians and the conversation with patients is integral to our approach to analysing implementation. That is, that this is an evolution, and we want to keep hearing back from clinicians about what are the bits that look like they're going well and what are the bits that they're struggling with, what are the ways of teaching which seem to be working, what are the ways of mentoring that are working, and what are the bits that are still works in progress. And similarly, from the patient perspective, Pete mentioned earlier, we want to know more about who it didn't work for. So the other line of research that we've got going from the Restore trial is moderation analysis. So mediation is about trying to understand why does something work or why does something not work, whereas moderation is about trying to understand for whom is it working and for whom is it not working, and what are the things that identify that, because CFT wasn't for everyone, and we want to understand more about that. So there's also a line of papers that will come out around moderation.
And I have one, and it's a completely selfish question that I'll ask before I have the open it up to the questions we have kind of piling up here. Any plans to bring this to the U.S.? I mean, the U.S. needs it. I mean, everywhere needs it. The whole world needs it. There's nobody should be first in line by any means. But I'm just curious if there's any plans for expanding its reach to start reaching more people?
Yeah, so that's probably fits in with what PK's highlighted, that we feel a huge responsibility as researchers to not overstate our data. Uh, to be very clear about what this doesn't tell us. It's not a panacea, but it looks like it's doing something good for a tough group of people, and the patients like it, and the clinicians liked it. So that's the two really important things. So we're really interested in developing ways in which we can support clinical communities to upskill. That's what we're interested in doing, and learn from that process. So we're interested in partnering with clinical communities to do that. And we realize that the next step from this trial is a series of implementation studies where we go, okay, we've gone from a clinical trial to a real world setting. And this is what's happening at the moment, or as planned. There are a number of training implementation trials where we train groups of clinicians in different care settings with different kind of patient groups in different countries, to go, can we replicate this in a real world setting? And what is it like for the clinician? And what is it like for the patient? Because that's really the important question. Does this intervention work in America? Well, I've been to America. I've seen this, I've seen how this healthcare looks there. It's freaking scary. And we're not that far away from it. So there are so many perverse incentives as well. Like we know in Australia, for example, you can get a $50,000 fusion covered by the government, but you can only get $250 worth of treatment from a physio. It's bullshit. Like that's a massive problem we have. And what it does is it feeds this quick consult kind of treatment that physios are trapped in. They come in, give them a push, give them a rub, give them a tweak, push them outdoor, give them a couple of exercises. They have no time to take a story. They have no time to take a patient on a journey. We have to upend the health system to go, we need to spend more time with people. We need to upskill clinicians to adequately manage people. Well, and we need to prevent this stuff happening. We've got people who have 4 years of care seeking. What if we got to them earlier? That's a whole other question and research down the track as well. Can we prevent that from happening at the very get-go? Because they're done. Yeah, so there's a whole lot of thoughts around that we have, and long answer to your question. Of course we want to be able to support clinicians in different communities. We're also really interested in supporting clinicians in lower income countries because they don't get access to any knowledge. And that's something we feel very, very strongly about, of like providing equitable access to knowledge for everybody. So they're kind of really big plans that we have, and we're still working them through. But it's something that we're not interested, and we've never been interested in brand, trademarking and creating a big business to enrich ourselves. We're really interested in partnering with people, with clinicians who've got an interest, and this is not for everybody. And for patients to support their journey. That's what we're interested in. So yeah, long answer, yes.
No, and I appreciate it. No, that was great. That was great. I'm going to get into a few questions. We had a few people. David, I think you spoke to this a bit already, but if you could just maybe clarify. He's wondering about the effects for patients with very high symptom severity. Was treatment more or less effective for those with mild pain versus severe pain?
I was working on code 2 days ago. That's part of that moderation analysis. Was it more or less effective for people with high pain, more or less effective with people with high disability, more or less effective with people with high distress, etc.? We're not there yet.
Okay, so
but we're on it.
We're definitely interested in that. Just anecdotally from a clinical point of view, we see people, we often go, oh, that person's got too high pain. We see high pain and high distress go together. If you reduce people's distress, you can see dramatic shifts in pain without doing something to them. And that's another area of research we're really interested in, is actually looking at the in-session change. Because people think you have to do something to someone to give them pain relief. And like, that is just not true. Like, you know, we see people come in literally with awkward frame, walk out. You know, it sounds ridiculous, but it's the real world. When a human being thinks they're screwed and they're really distressed, their pain system goes crazy. If you dial down the stress and you build confidence back in the body, you will often see that system dial down dramatically. We're super interested in that. And as Peter said, we've got different pathways to explore these things. They're really interesting for us. I don't think it's as simple as saying this works for this level of pain or for that level of pain. We deliberately included people in this trial who were on the higher risk category because we think this is who needs this care.
Good. Now, there was questions, and you've already answered this. There's definitely plans to translate the website and materials to kind of expand it into other countries, and so that's been answered. Another question: do you think CFT will be effective with acute low back pain? Is it only going to be relevant for chronic cases?
Yeah, so I get asked this question all the time. So interesting. We this will come out in Phoebe Simpson's qualitative work. But what we heard from the clinicians who went through the training is they said, "This has changed how I treat everybody. This has changed how I treat acute back pain. It's changed how we treat knees and hip pain, you know, neck pain, shoulder pain. It's just changed how we work." So we have a view. We have a lot more work coming out on this, and with some pilot work around. JP Canero has done a feasibility trial around people who have been told they need a knee replacement with knee arthritis. And we've got some pilot work around chronic hip pain as well. We see these as just good basic model. It's a good model of care. And so in the acute back pain space, we were involved in a trial or a cohort study looking at who goes into emergency departments with acute non-traumatic pain. The majority is back pain. These are people who have not had a trauma, had a massive pain flare-up, freak out and go to ED. Where do those people go? Because we know that most acute back pain is a flare-up of chronic pain. It's like your first event's normally during your adolescence. So I think we've got this idea that back pain, acute pain is injury. Most acute back pain is not injury. It's like bending over to brush your teeth.
Yeah. No, I can relate to that.
So yeah, look, we are really interested in that. We've got so many plans for research, just capacity and funding are our main limits. But you know, of course we need to screen for red flags and serious pathology, and that's just part of our clinical reasoning process. We have to do that. So we don't want to be treating fractures and people with quarter equina and malignancies, and that shit's just good care and triage. We don't want to do that. So we rule out pathology, and where there's an absence of pathology, we address the biopsychosocial drivers and make sure that we support people's journeys so they don't get shit care and get into trouble.
Yeah, that just, I mean, to me, like you mentioned, my treatment has changed. I'm not by any means saying I'm certified in CFT, but a lot less interventional, a lot more supportive. And lo and behold, the interventions feel like they're collecting dust, certain ones. I mean, they're still definitely, like you said, we need to be good triage, great musculoskeletal screeners, making sure red flags and all those things. It doesn't mean any of those skillful interventions or examination strategies go away.
And we're not anti-manual therapy. So I'm a manual therapist. I use my hands all the time. And CFT is hands-on. It's just not lying someone down and doing shit to them. But I think, you know, we realize that manual therapy can have a role, I think, in some cases, particularly if the patient's expecting and wanting it. But if we've tried it and it doesn't work, we've got to move on.
Yeah. No, agree. PK, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, going back to the previous question about translating to the website, if you go to the website using Google Chrome, you can ask it to auto-translate into whatever language you like. So that's a way of doing that now.
It's a good point. Good point. Modern technology can do some pretty cool things. There's one question about, curious to see data following therapists who are trained in CFT for this trial to see how their outcomes are with patients over an extended period of time. He had referenced like some of the studies, I think, on motivation interviewing is like therapists, their treatment fidelity faded over time to where they might have slipped into bad habits. I'm curious as to if there's anything you're doing to track that, or is there any thoughts you have on some of the challenges to where just like patients can slip back into maybe old beliefs and behaviors?
Totally. Yeah. Well, that's why we're really interested in training clinical communities, not individuals, because we think the most sustainable way for this to, to evolve will be to train a community. We've heard that clinicians who are working in a practice, for example, or a clinical community where it's very biomedical, it's really tough for them. And it, it could be really a very lonely place for them. So, we know that you'll get clinician drift if you don't have a supportive community. That it's like growing a garden. You stop watering it, it's just going to die. So, as clinicians, we need to keep watering and fertilizing and supporting our garden. And that's probably my gripe with social media. It's so aggressive. It's like this thing against that thing, and there's bagging people. I hate it. And the only reason I'm still on there, and there are days I really wonder if I should, is because I feel like if there's an absence of some, promoting some positive messages, who fills that gap? And so we really love this idea of supporting clinical communities as we do supporting patient communities. And that's about growth. That's about encouragement. That's about not bagging each other out and telling them that's shit and you're this and my treatment's better than yours. Honestly, like, if the patient gets better, I don't care what you do. I don't care. If they get their life back, I don't care if you bloody give them herbs. I don't care. The bottom line is the patient. And that's where I think, this idea of building communities and supporting communities, and they might be virtual communities, they'll be real local communities. We love that thought, because there are lots of good people around the world who might be feeling quite lonely in their workplace. We would love to pull those people together.
Yeah. No, I definitely have talked to a few where they've struggled with some of that, feeling like they're on an island, trying to treat the way they want to and seeing that it's not necessarily being reflected around them. And I think that's a great idea.
Drift is important, and we're interested in it. And it's one of our thoughts is to re-look at the people we've trained down the track and go, it's something we will do actually, and go, are they still delivering what we thought?
Yeah. No, I will look forward to it. I mean, I want to respect both your times. I mean, you've been amazingly generous with your times today already. Really have got some huge value from what you guys are discussing. And I wanted to thank you both for, I can only imagine the immense amount of work you both put into this to make this kind of trial happen. And I know you have a team of folks that you're working with that are doing some amazing things to help the cause out. I know if we could get more researchers like yourselves and pushing this message forward, which I really applaud you both for doing all the great work you're doing. So thank you so much.
Can I just say something to that, Mark? Peter Kent is not a guy on social media. You won't see him out there, but oh my God, this guy has just a few of us have nearly killed ourselves in their journey, but he has, his leadership has been unbelievable, but also backed up with some amazing people, Mark Hancock, Ann Smith, JP Canero. The clinicians delivered this intervention. We have to put a huge hand up to them. The patients who trusted in us to come into this trial. There's a whole network of people who supported Rob Schutzer. The different. There are so many people, and they're on the website. We acknowledge them, that have done so much work. You might want to add to that, Peter, as well. But we have to really acknowledge this is a monster thing to pull off. Huge amount of work from a lot of people.
And also, of course, to thank the funders, the National Health and Medical Research Council, which is our peak medical funding body, and Curtin University also put in some top-up money. But I think my last comment would be, I think Pete's pointer towards the clinician is a really good final thing to say, which is these results are not our results. These results are the clinicians' results. We trained them as best as we could, and we supported them as best as they could. But those 18 physios who had little exposure to TFT at the beginning of the trial, but were brave enough to say, yes, I'm willing to expose myself and go through the training period, no matter how rigorous that is, this is their results with a really tough group of cohorts. It's no one on the trial team, so all credit to them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I
And
appreciate it.
just on that too, Mark, you probably want to get her out of here, but
Oh, no
I
worries.
was banished. I was banished from the trial when the training finished. They didn't want my fingerprints on anything, so that was really good in some ways. Like my job was done theoretically once the training. JP supported me with that, but after that, I had no influence on that trial or any patient discussions or anything for that reason.
Yeah. No, it's. I've greatly appreciated all the work and with all the support team that you guys have. Thanks to them. I know we put the website on the chat here for those. We'll link it in the show notes when we post the podcast and the YouTube episodes, so everybody can check that out and get to see the immense amount of work that went into that with a great team of folks. So again, thank you both for your time tonight. I really appreciate it. For those of you who are watching, hope you enjoyed, and we will talk to you next time.